Cassia Thorne had a system. 6 a.m. Unlock the front door. Flip the sign. Start the coffee. 6:15, restock the bottom shelf near the window, the one that always ran low on dried olives and imported noodles. 7 a.m., greet Mr. Osei from the laundromat next door, who stopped in every morning for black coffee and the same 3 minutes of conversation about the weather. Never a minute more, never a minute less. 9 a.m., wipe down every surface until the shop smelled like lemon and order. Routine. That was the whole point. Routine meant invisible. Invisible meant safe. The shop itself wasn't much to look at. Cramped aisles, wooden shelves with a slight leftward lean that she had never bothered to fix because the lean was useful. It meant anyone who entered had to angle their body a specific way to move through the store, and she had memorized every variation of that angle. The cash register was old enough to have its own moods. The handwritten price tags were precise. One overhead light buzzed faintly when the weather shifted, and Cassia used it the same way other people used barometers. She knew where every single item lived. She knew which floorboard creaked third from the door, slight left, and she knew the exact weight of the silence that settled over the shop at 2 p.m., when foot traffic died and the neighborhood exhaled. She had built that silence. She intended to keep it. 3 years ago, Cassia Thorne had a different life. A real one, the kind with a name attached to it. You scrolled past 100 videos today. You stopped for this one. Maybe that's not an accident. If Cassia's story hits different, if you've ever had to go quiet and build something new from nothing, just to survive, then you already know this story isn't just fiction. Don't let this be the one you got halfway. Drop a comment, like, subscribe, and let me know what part of the world you're watching from. Because what happens when the most dangerous linguistic asset the U.S. government ever trained decides to stop disappearing? Everything changes. 3 years ago, Cassia Thorne had a different life. A real one. The kind with a name attached to it. She'd spent a decade becoming indispensable in rooms that hadn't been designed to hold a woman who looked like her. Dark-skinned, sharp-eyed, with a stillness about her that people always mistook for softness right up until the moment they didn't. She had a gift, the kind that couldn't be manufactured or borrowed or bought, an almost violent intimacy with language. The way other people heard music, Cassia heard syntax. She heard the gaps between words, the pressure behind syllables, the specific emotional architecture of a sentence built to deceive. The Department of Defense had used that gift for 12 years and had compensated her well for it, and had never once made her feel like anything other than a resource. And then someone decided that resource knew too much. She never saw the evidence until it was already everywhere. A paper trail so clean it didn't look planted. It looked inevitable. Bank records, correspondence, a single photograph that shouldn't have existed and somehow did. The story that assembled itself around her was airtight. And the people who could have dismantled it chose silence instead, because the evidence was too good to argue with, and the people building it were too dangerous to challenge. She didn't fight it. She understood, with the precision of someone who'd spent her career reading power dynamics, that fighting would only accelerate the burial. So she disappeared. And she rebuilt. And she waited. That was the version of herself she carried behind the counter of Thorne's provisions every single day. Quiet, methodical, patient to the point of something that felt almost like peace. Almost. Jeju-eo's enforcer moved first, the one near the window. She'd clocked him as the more reactive of the two, shoulders too tight, trigger reflex trained but not disciplined, reached inside his jacket the moment Cassia finished speaking. The movement was smooth, as practiced, meant to be a reminder of what existed behind Jeju-eo's words. Jeju-eo stopped him with 2 fingers raised. Just 2. Barely a gesture, but the enforcer froze as if he'd hit a wall. The shop held its breath. Jeju-eo's jaw was working. Not in anger. She'd seen anger on powerful men her entire career and knew its specific texture. This was something raw. Recalibration. The particular internal scrambling of a man who'd built every room he walked into around one fixed assumption and had just watched that assumption dissolve in real time. He straightened slowly, pulled his composure back around himself like a jacket. "You speak Jeju-eo," he said. English, flat, not a question. "I speak it correctly," Cassia said, "which is more than you do." The enforcer by the door shifted his weight. Cassia didn't look at him. She kept her dark eyes fixed on Jeju-eo, her hands still and open on the wooden counter, her body language communicating exactly nothing, which was its own kind of language and one she'd been fluent in long before she ever learned Jeju-eo. Jeju-eo stared at her for a long moment, long enough that the silence took on texture. "Who are you?" he said finally. She reached beneath the counter without breaking eye contact and produced a small monitor, the kind that looked at a glance like a standard security display. She turned it to face him. 4 angles, exterior footage, and on one of those feeds, positioned halfway down the block with their lights off and their engine running, were 2 of his own vehicles. Not hers. His. "Your people have been outside this block for 40 minutes, Cassia said. "They're not watching me." "They're watching you. The man on the left in the gray jacket. He made a call 8 minutes ago that lasted 40 seconds. Not long enough to report in, long enough to confirm a position." Jeju-eo looked at the monitor. Something moved behind his eyes. Not fear exactly, but the cold, clarifying shock of a man who has just understood that the game changed without his knowledge, and he's been playing the wrong version of it. "That's not possible," he said. "Those men are compromised," Cassia said, "or redirected. Either way, they didn't come here for me." The wolf tattoo on his neck seemed to tighten as his jaw set hard. Cassia watched him absorb it. She watched the exact moment the weight of it landed, the way his shoulders changed, a barely perceptible drop. Like his body doing what bodies do when the ground shifts and there's nowhere left to stand that feels solid. She recognized it. She'd felt it herself, 3 years ago, standing in a hallway outside a classified briefing room, holding a folder of evidence against herself that she hadn't had time to fabricate. She recognized it because it was the same. "Sit down," she said, "before they figure out I've seen the feed." He didn't move immediately. Pride doing what pride always does, making one last argument before it concedes. She watched it happen across his face, that interior negotiation, the weight of his reputation pressing against the cold logic of his situation. Then he pulled out the stool she kept behind the counter for inventory shifts and sat down. And Jeju-eo, the wolf, the syndicate boss, the man who had walked into her store 10 minutes ago as a predator, sat in her shop with the tight, careful posture of a man holding very still so nothing else could break. Cassia turned the monitor back around and went to lock the front door. "Business hours are over," she said. "Let's talk." The back room of Thorne's Provisions was not meant for 2 people. It was narrow and low-lit, stacked with surplus inventory along one wall and dominated by a workstation along the other that looked dramatically out of place among the wooden shelves and handwritten stock lists. 2 monitors, a compact server unit, encrypted external drives lined up like soldiers in a row. Jeju-eo sat on the edge of an overturned crate and said nothing for a full 30 seconds, which told Cassia more about the state of him than any words would have. She handed him a clean cloth for the cut on his temple he didn't know he had. He took it without looking at her, pressed it to his skin with practiced efficiency, and studied the workstation. "This isn't a grocery store," he said. "It's also a grocery store," she said. She sat down in front of the monitors, pulled up a feed she'd been tracking for 6 weeks. Encrypted communications routed through a commercial server in New Jersey, disguised inside ordinary data traffic from a dozen small businesses in the area. She'd been patient with it, had learned to read its rhythms the way she read everything, the way she read him right now, by what it chose not to show. "Your lieutenant," she said, not looking away from the screen. "The one you trust most. He uses a burner rotation, new device every 72 hours. Jeju-eo's posture changed. Minute. Controlled. Most people who run operations use burner rotations. Not like this. The rotation pattern is encrypted with a 7-character key that changes on a schedule. I've seen that specific protocol before. She pulled up a file, pages of cross-referenced data, printed and annotated in her careful handwriting, overlaid with digital markups on the screen. 3 years ago, Department of Defense, Black Budget Communications Arm. Your lieutenant isn't running independent security, Jeju-eo. Someone gave him that protocol, someone with government access. The silence that followed had a specific weight to it. Jeju-eo leaned forward, his forearms on his knees, the cloth still pressed to his temple. In the dim amber light of the back room, without the enforced composure of his public performance, he looked, not smaller exactly, but more precise, like the forest green suit and the deliberate menace had been armor he wore for rooms that required it, and stripped back, what remained was something sharper and considerably more dangerous than what he'd brought through her door. She noticed this. Filed it. The general, he said quietly. Not a question this time either. She looked at him. I've heard the name, he said. In the context of the dockside operation. Someone above my lieutenant's pay grade was providing intelligence on rival syndicates, information that was too clean to come from inside our network. We assumed it was a bought official, a low-level one. It's not low-level, Cassia said. The man who built the lie that ended my career has been running a parallel operation through your syndicate for at least 2 years, using your infrastructure, your people, your distribution channels, as a, she chose the word deliberately, laundry operation, for funding that cannot appear on any government balance sheet. Jeju-eo sat back, slowly. And my lieutenant, he said, is either being paid to facilitate it or is being coerced into it. I don't know which yet. She paused. But the media drops targeting you. The planted evidence, that's the general cleaning house, eliminating anyone inside or outside the syndicate who has enough operational knowledge to expose the arrangement. Jeju-eo was very still. The wolf on his neck was level with her eye line from where she sat, and she watched it shift as his throat moved. He's eliminating me, he said. Because I'm the only person inside the syndicate who knows enough to actually understand what I've been facilitating. Yes. Another silence, different in texture from the ones before it. This one had the specific quality of 2 people who've just confirmed they're standing in the same ruin and need to decide, together, what to build from it. She watched him process it, watched him move through the stages of it, the cold recognition, the recalibration, the thing that came after, which in men like him she'd always found difficult to name. It wasn't vulnerability exactly. It was more like a weapon being set down briefly, not surrendered, just paused. 3 years, he said finally. You've been building this for 3 years. Quietly, she said. Yes. He looked at her then. Really looked. The way he hadn't allowed himself to in the shop, without the armor of his performance, without the smirk or the practiced menace. His eyes moved across her face with the careful attention of a man reading a document he knows is going to change something fundamental, and Cassia held his gaze without offering him anything except the steady, level fact of herself. You're not going to let me leave, he said. Not accusatory, just precise. You don't want to leave, she said. Out there, they're waiting to finish what they started. In here, you have the only person in the tri-state area who understands exactly what's being done to you and why. A long beat. What do you want from me? He said. She turned back to the monitors. Everything you know about the dockside operation, she said. Every name, every meeting. Every exchange you facilitated that didn't make sense at the time. All of it. She heard him exhale. Slow, controlled, the sound of a man making a decision he already knows is irreversible. Then you'd better make coffee, he said. This is going to take a while. She made coffee. Black. No discussion about it. Jeju-eo wrapped both hands around the mug like a man who hadn't felt warm in days, which, she suspected, was close to accurate. The cut above his temple had stopped bleeding. She'd cleaned it without being asked, and without making it into anything, just produced antiseptic and gauze from the first aid kit behind the server unit and worked with the same quiet efficiency she applied to everything in this shop. He'd watched her hands the whole time, said nothing. Outside, the neighborhood moved the way it always did at dusk. She could hear it, the specific rhythm of this block, the one she'd memorized over 3 years of deliberate, patient observation. Mrs. Park's television through the wall of the building adjacent, the delivery truck that idled too long outside the laundromat on Thursdays, the particular sound of the corner 2 blocks down when the foot traffic shifted from working-day pedestrians to something less predictable. She heard all of it. She'd always heard all of it. Jeju-eo had started talking. He talked the way men do when they've been carrying something that's become structurally unsound, carefully at first, testing the weight of each disclosure before committing to the next, watching her face for the specific reaction that would tell him whether she could be trusted with more. She gave him nothing. Listened without reacting, which she knew from experience was its own form of pressure. Silence applied correctly is more extractive than any interrogation technique. He told her about the docks, about the shipping containers that moved through his network's protection corridor and were never opened, never inventoried, never discussed beyond the logistics of getting them from point A to point B without interference. About the payments that arrived from a corporate entity his lieutenant had introduced him to, a real estate holding company with an address in Delaware and a contact number that routed to a man who gave his name as Parker and always called from a different state. About the meeting, 18 months ago, where his lieutenant had sat across from him and laid out what Parker was offering. Expanded protection revenue, legitimate business cover through a construction subsidiary, political insulation from a federal contact who could manage any inconvenient attention from law enforcement. I asked who the federal contact was, Jeju-eo said. My lieutenant said the name didn't matter, that the arrangement would speak for itself. And you accepted, Cassia said. I accepted, he said. Flat. No defense in it. She appreciated that. The men who tried to justify themselves in retrospect were always the most dangerous because their honesty had a ceiling. The money was real. The insulation was real. For 14 months it worked exactly the way it was supposed to. And then the media drop started. 7 weeks ago, his jaw tightened, and my lieutenant stopped looking me in the eye about 6 weeks ago. Small thing. The kind of thing you file away and don't examine until you have reason to. Cassia turned to one of her monitors, pulled up a document she'd built over the previous 5 weeks, a timeline, transaction dates, media cycles, personnel movements inside the syndicate cross-referenced with patterns she'd identified in the framing architecture used against her 3 years prior. She turned the screen to face him. He leaned forward. Red. She watched the muscles along his jaw work as the connections assembled themselves. This column, she said, pointing to a sequence of dates highlighted in red. These are the dates your containers moved through the dockside corridor. These, she moved to the adjacent column, are the dates of specific dark budget fund transfers I tracked through 3 shell companies back to a Congressional Appropriations Subcommittee account. The timing is not coincidental. They've been using my operation to launder classified funding, he said slowly, for a program that doesn't officially exist. And now that the program is under internal review, a whistleblower inside the Defense Department flagged the subcommittee account 4 months ago. They need the pipeline to disappear, which means everyone who touched it needs to disappear. She met his eyes. That's you. That's your lieutenant eventually, once he's no longer useful. That's me. I was the linguist who first flagged the anomalous communication patterns 3 years ago. They eliminated me preventively before I could formalize the report. Jeju-eo sat back. He set the mug down on the corner of her desk with the deliberate care of a man managing his hands because the alternative was less controlled. The meeting, he said, in 4 days. Is not a negotiation, Cassia said. It's a closing ceremony. They intend to formalize your removal from the syndicate leadership, install your lieutenant in your position, and ensure you have no functional credibility left to speak from. After which, the liability question becomes very simple to resolve. He understood what she meant by liability. The ambient sound of the neighborhood filled the silence between them. Outside, the block was doing what it always did, carrying on, oblivious. The ordinary machinery of people living their lives in close proximity to something they couldn't see. She watched him from the corner of her eye. In the low light, the wolf tattoo on his neck was shadow and contrast, the lines of it stark against his skin. His hands were flat on his thighs. His breathing was measured in the way that only happens when someone is actively controlling it. She'd seen that before too. In the field. In people who just understood the precise dimensions of the danger they were in and had made the decision to remain functional inside it rather than be consumed by it. She found, to her own quiet surprise, that she respected it. "I have 3 notebooks," she said, "and you have names I've had as question marks for 18 months. We start there. We work through the night." She pulled the first notebook from the shelf above her workstation. "And tomorrow, we start building the thing that ends this." He looked at her for a moment. The complicated geometry of his expression, the wariness, the calculation, and underneath both of those, something that hadn't been there when he'd walked through her door that afternoon. "You've been alone in this for 3 years," he said. It wasn't pity. She would have shut that down immediately. It was something more precise, recognition maybe, the specific acknowledgement of one person who has operated in isolation for too long to another. "Yes," she said, simply. He nodded once, picked up his coffee, and said, "Show me the first notebook." They worked through the night. By midnight, the grocery store had become something else entirely. The overhead light was off, too visible from the street, and the back room ran on the amber glow of her monitors and a single directional lamp that threw their shadows long against the inventory shelves. The notebooks were open on every available surface. She'd run 3 separate cross-referencing threads simultaneously, moving between them with the fluid efficiency of a woman who had spent years building a system inside her own mind before she'd ever put it on paper. Jeju-eo filled the gaps. He was methodical about it. She hadn't expected that. She'd anticipated ego, the kind of selective disclosure men in his position defaulted to when they didn't fully trust the room. Instead, he moved through his own operational history with the dispassion of someone reading a brief about a stranger. Names she'd had as question marks for 18 months became real. Corporate structures she'd mapped as approximations sharpened into precision. 2 shell companies she'd identified as probable but unconfirmed were confirmed in the first 40 minutes. By the second hour, the picture assembled across her counter was no longer a map of separate events. It was a single, continuous operation. The general, the man at the center of the architecture, the man who had built the lie that had taken her name and her career and her life, had been running a parallel intelligence network funded through classified congressional appropriations and laundered through criminal infrastructure for at least 5 years. The syndicate was one node. There were others. The operation spanned 3 cities and 2 foreign ports and had been invisible precisely because it was designed to be the legitimate half concealed by the classified half, the criminal half concealed by both. Cassia set her pen down at 1:47 a.m. and stared at the full map for a long moment. "He's been doing this since before me," she said quietly. "Long before you," Jeju-eo confirmed. He was sitting directly across from her now, close enough that she could see the exact lines of fatigue setting in around his eyes. Not weakness, just the honest physical record of a week that had tried to kill him in several distinct ways. "I was brought in as a new node when the previous infrastructure was retired." She looked at him. "Retired?" "Yes." She didn't ask him to elaborate. She didn't need to. She understood what retired meant in the operational vocabulary of men like the general, and of men like Jeju-eo for that matter. The difference between them, she was beginning to understand, was not as categorical as she'd assumed when he'd first walked through her door with his wolf tattoo and his weaponized language and his practiced predator's smile. Jeju-eo had operated inside a system he hadn't built and had convinced himself the corruption was bounded. The general had built the system and had never had any illusions about what it was. "There are 4 of them," Junho said, pointing to a cluster of names in her second notebook. The general is the architect. These two are his financial infrastructure. Both have congressional connections. This one, he tapped a name she'd circled in red, is the operations coordinator. He's the one who managed my lieutenant, the one who built the media drops. I know that name, Cassia said. She pulled up a digital file. He was attached to the same defense contractor that handled my security clearance review. He was in the building the day my evidence appeared. Junho looked at her, a look that lasted a beat longer than practical necessity required. She felt it, the specific quality of being seen clearly by someone who wasn't offering softness with it, just attention. They built the same trap twice, he said. Because it worked the first time, she said. I disappeared. I didn't fight. I didn't go public. I went quiet and let them believe they'd contained the problem. They had no reason to develop a different method. That was a choice, he said carefully. It was, she agreed. I needed them to believe they'd won. I needed time, and I needed them comfortable. Comfortable people make mistakes. She closed the notebook. They've made several. I've documented all of them. What I've been missing is testimony. Someone who was inside the room. Someone whose account stands up to the specific architecture of the evidence. Someone who can speak to intent rather than just pattern. He was quiet for a moment. She watched his chest rise and fall, watched the lamplight move across the planes of his face, the hard line of his jaw, the dark ink of the tattoo, the particular tiredness around his eyes that hadn't broken his posture. He was holding himself together with the discipline of a man who had learned very young that the first thing to go in a crisis must never be your spine. You want me to wire the meeting, he said. I want you to walk into that meeting, she said. Sit down and let them confirm everything, on record, in their own words. The silence stretched. The shop breathed around them. The building settled. Somewhere outside, 2 blocks over, a car rolled slowly past. Cassia's eyes went to her exterior feed without thinking. Her body had never stopped monitoring. Even through 6 hours of documentation work, some part of her had been listening to the neighborhood the way you listen for a change in someone's breathing. They took 3 years from you, Junho said finally. Not a question. His voice had dropped, lower, quieter, carrying something she wasn't sure she had a name for yet. Yes. And you built all of this. He gestured at the notebooks, the monitors, the entire quiet architecture of her 3-year operation. Alone. In a grocery store. She looked at him. The grocery store was never incidental. Something shifted in his expression. It wasn't warmth, exactly. They were too far inside danger and too far inside each other's operational perimeters for warmth. It was something more structural than that. More load-bearing. All right, he said. Tell me about the wire. She pulled the 3rd notebook from the shelf, the one she'd started 6 months ago, when she'd first begun to believe that the thread was close enough to pull, and opened it to a page dense with technical specifications. The transmitter will be small, she said, hidden inside a cufflink. It bypasses signal jammers by using a frequency band they won't think to block because it's technically licensed to a commercial agricultural monitoring company in Iowa. She paused. I need 48 hours to build it. Junho looked at the specifications, then at her. You can build a frequency jamming bypass transmitter. I can build a lot of things, she said. I've had 3 years and very little else to occupy me. For the first time since he'd sat on her stool in the back room of her shop, the expression that moved across his face was not wariness or recalibration or the careful management of a difficult situation. It was something that looked, briefly and precisely, like awe. He covered it quickly, but she saw it, filed it, said nothing. I'm going to need a clean change of clothes, he said. Second shelf, storage room, she said. I keep emergency inventory. Nothing will fit you perfectly, but it'll get you through the next 12 hours. He stood. His ribs caught. She saw it in the way he moved. The slight compression of his frame. And she stood at the same moment, instinctive, not offering help but placing herself within reach of it. He looked at her. That look again. level, complicated, something in it that hadn't existed 4 hours ago. "Cassia," he said, first time he'd used her name. She waited. "I came into your store to humiliate you," he said. No smoothness on it, just the flat, unornamented fact of it. "I know," she said, "and you already knew who I was." "I'd been tracking your movements for 4 months. A beat. And you still charged me for the noodles." "Full price," she confirmed. "Business is business." The sound that came out of him was low and brief and real, not performed, not strategic. Just the involuntary response of a man who'd been sucker-punched by something that was technically funny but carried weight. She went to the door of the storage room and paused. "Get some sleep," she said. "We start on the transmitter at 6. They came at 2 a.m. 2 black SUVs, lights off, positioned at the east and west ends of the block in the configuration she'd studied in tactical threat assessments years before she'd ever heard of Thorne's provisions. She saw them on the exterior feed 12 minutes before they moved, long enough to do what needed doing, not long enough for anything she'd call comfort. She killed the amber lamp with one hand and had Jeju-eo on his feet with the other before he'd finished registering the change in light. "How many?" He was immediately, completely awake. The shift was instantaneous, from sleep to operational in a single breath. She noted it without comment. 5, maybe 6. 2 vehicles. A professional configuration. She moved to the server unit, executed a data encryption sequence she'd drilled so many times it lived in her hands rather than her head. "They're not here to negotiate." "No," he said. "They wouldn't send this many for negotiation." She was already moving. Through the back room, into the main body of the shop, navigating in total darkness with the ease of someone who had walked this floor 10,000 times and knew it the way she knew her own breathing. Jeju-eo followed close, closer than she expected, quieter than she would have predicted, his footfalls adapting to the narrow aisle width with the instinctive body intelligence of a man who had moved through dangerous spaces before. "Third aisle," she said, her voice barely sound. "Stay behind the shelving unit on the east wall. Don't move until I tell you." "What are you going to do?" "Run the store," she said. She heard him pull breath through his nose at that. Not fear. Something edged with it, though. The front door came in hard. Not the bell this time. The door itself, forced with the specific controlled violence of people who'd done this before and weren't interested in subtlety. 2 men through the front, moving fast, small tactical lights sweeping low, floor level, checking for tripwires, which told her these were trained. Not syndicate muscle, cleaners, the kind of professionals who don't leave evidence because they don't leave witnesses. A third entry point, the side window she'd noted 6 months ago as a structural vulnerability and had never actually reinforced, because a vulnerability you know about is not a weakness. It's a door you control. The man through the window landed in a crouch and came up with his light sweeping the second aisle. Cassia was not in the second aisle. She was in the gap between the shelving units against the east wall, a gap of approximately 14 inches that most people wouldn't register as habitable space, and that she had measured specifically because most people wouldn't register it. She moved when his light passed. The first man through the window was down before he understood the geometry of what had happened. She moved through the dark with the cold precision of someone for whom the dark had never been the enemy. It was just another field condition, and she'd operated in worse. She used the narrow aisle as leverage, the shelving as cover and weapon both. A heavy inventory crate, positioned on the second shelf at precisely shoulder height for a man of average build, came down with the specific sound of catastrophic misfortune. The noise pulled both front entrymen toward the second aisle. She was already in the first. Jeju-eo moved from the east wall without being told. She heard it, his body's response to the opening, the instinct of a man who had been many things in his life, but never passive when action was available. He came out of the dark from the left as she'd drawn them from the right, and what happened in the next 40 seconds was neither elegant nor choreographed. It was a grocery store brawl in complete darkness between four people with serious motivations and the specific, concentrated violence of those who cannot afford to lose. Glass broke, shelving collapsed. Someone hit the wooden floor hard enough that the impact traveled through the boards to her feet 2 aisles over. She heard Jeju-eo take a hit, the grunt of it, the sound of weight redistributing under impact, and she was already moving toward it before the sound finished, coming through the gap between shelves with the particular efficiency of a woman who has converted 12 years of theoretical training into something that lives in the body rather than the mind. The man who had Jeju-eo's jacket in his fist found her before he found a reason to feel good about that development. When the silence came back, it came back complete. The shop was a wreck. Shelving down in the second and third aisles, glass from 3 broken inventory jars glittering across the floor, the old register vibrating faintly from a collision with the counter's edge. 5 men in various states of incapacitation distributed across approximately 400 square feet. Jeju-eo was on one knee between 2 toppled shelves, one hand braced against the floor. His breathing was controlled, shallow, working around his ribs, which she suspected had gone from bad to worse somewhere in the second aisle. His silver rings caught what little ambient light bled in from the street outside, and his eyes, when he looked up at her through the dark, held something she felt across the distance between them. "You," he said, between measured breaths, "are not just a shopkeeper." She reached down. Her hand closed around his forearm. She felt the tension in him, the hot wire of pain he was managing, the steel-cable discipline of a man who would not let his body override his composure. She pulled him up. "No," she agreed. He stood. Their proximity in the narrow aisle was closer than circumstance required. She was aware of it, the specific warmth of him, the controlled rhythm of his breath, the way his eyes hadn't moved from her face since she'd pulled him to his feet. She stepped back, measured. "Can you walk?" she said. His jaw shifted. "I've walked on worse." "I know," she said. "Sit on the stool anyway." She built the transmitter in 4 hours and 20 minutes. Jeju-eo slept in the back room for 3 of those hours, sitting upright on the crate with his back against the wall and his arms crossed. Not the sleep of the comfortable, but the compressed, utilitarian rest of a man who has learned to take what the situation offers and not require it to be more. Cassia worked under the directional lamp with the kind of focus that had always come to her in the hours before dawn, when the world quieted enough that she could hear herself think in 3 dimensions simultaneously. The cufflink was silver, small, unremarkable, the kind of thing a man in a tailored suit wears because his wardrobe demands it, not because he's thought about it. Inside the casing, in a space approximately the diameter of a pencil eraser, she assembled a transmitter running on a frequency band registered to an agricultural monitoring company in Iowa, which no signal jamming system in a private restaurant would be calibrated to detect, because no threat assessment model would flag Iowa farming equipment as an operational risk. She was done by 5:47 a.m. He woke at 6 without being prompted. She heard the shift in his breathing from across the room and turned before he'd opened his eyes. An old field habit, the kind you never fully train yourself out of. He came awake the same way he'd come awake the night before, in that single clean transition from sleep to present, his body organized and his eyes clear before they'd been open for a full second. He looked at the cufflink on the workstation between them. "That's it," he said. "That's it." He picked it up, turned it over between 2 fingers, examining it with the careful attention of a man who understood the weight of small things. "The meeting is tomorrow evening," he said. "Red room, private dining, back section. Signal jammers active from the moment the room is secured, which will be 90 minutes before you're scheduled to arrive," she said. "I know. I've been monitoring the venue's power draw for the last 2 weeks. The jammer signature is distinctive." She paused. "The transmitter activates on contact with skin temperature. Once you put it on, it runs continuously. The broadcast goes to 7 recipients simultaneously, 4 journalists, 2 federal investigators, and 1 independent media outlet that has been building its own case for 8 months. I've been in contact with their lead reporter. He looked up from the cufflink. How long have you been planning this specific exit? Since 6 weeks ago, she said, when I confirmed the timeline of the media drops matched the pattern I'd built. She met his eyes. I was missing a witness. I've spent 6 weeks running parallel to you, waiting for the right moment. And I walked into your store, he said, and handed me everything I needed. Something moved through his expression, layered, complicated, moving too fast beneath the surface for her to fully read. She didn't try. Some things weren't meant to be translated. He set the cufflink down. Walk me through the broadcast protocol. She did. For 2 hours, they worked through every contingency she'd mapped, the failure states, the backup routes, the specific timing windows within the meeting where key admissions were most likely to surface based on the behavioral patterns of the 4 men involved. She'd built profiles on all of them. She handed him the relevant pages and watched him read with the focused intensity of a man internalizing information he understands he may not get a second chance to use. When he finished, he set the pages down and said nothing for a moment. The shop around them was still wrecked from the night before. The morning light, thin, gray, coming in through the front window at a low angle, fell across the toppled shelving and the scattered inventory and the broken glass she hadn't had time to clear, and it gave the whole space a quality that was hard to name. Like a battlefield in the hour after, when the urgency is gone, and what remains is just the honest record of what happened. She watched him stand. He moved to the workstation mirror she'd never acknowledged having and did a quick inventory of the damage, the cut, the bruising along his jaw that had darkened overnight, the way he held his frame slightly off-center to manage his ribs. He straightened his collar with the precise, habitual gesture of a man who has performed composure in dangerous rooms his entire adult life. She crossed the back room and stood in front of him. He went still. She picked up the cufflink from the workstation, without asking. She reached for his left cuff. He didn't move, just watched her face with an expression she felt more than read, and fixed the cufflink in place with fingers that were steady because she made them steady. The transmitter pressed against the inside of his wrist. Warm now, active. She was close, closer than operational necessity required, and they both knew it. She finished, didn't step back immediately. His voice, when it came, was low. If I don't come out of that room, you'll come out of that room, she said. But if I don't? She looked up at him. His eyes were dark and direct and carrying the specific gravity of a man who has stopped pretending a thing isn't true. Then every file I've built for 3 years goes out automatically, she said. They don't need you alive to burn. I designed it that way. He held her gaze for a moment that stretched past what the conversation required. That's not actually comforting, he said. No, she agreed, but it's honest. Something in him softened. Not his face, not his posture. Something underneath both of those, something she felt in the abbreviated distance between them as a change in pressure, like a room after a window opens. When this is over, he said quietly. She waited. He didn't finish the sentence. She understood that too. Some things weren't sayable yet. Not in the middle of the operation, not inside the wreckage of the shop, not with the transmitter warm against his wrist and a room full of dangerous men waiting for him tomorrow. She took one step back, gave them both the room. Go, she said. Be exactly what they expect to see. Broken, desperate, reaching for any exit. She paused. You're a good enough performer. I've seen your work. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Then he straightened his jacket. That same habitual gesture, composure assembled deliberately over whatever was actually happening inside him, and walked toward the front of the shop. At the door, he stopped, didn't turn around. Don't let them win again, Cassia, he said. She was already at her workstation. They already lost, she said. They just don't know it yet. The bell above the door rang when he walked out, clean and sharp and specific in the early morning air. She watched him on the exterior feed until he turned the corner. Then she sat down and went to work. She watched it happen from the ruins of her shop. The laptop was open on the counter, the one remaining surface that hadn't been touched by the previous night's violence, running a clean audio stream through a relay that would have been invisible to anyone who hadn't spent 3 years specifically designing it to be. The exterior of the Red Room looked like what it was, a private dining establishment in Manhattan that served its legitimate clientele on weekdays and its other clientele whenever discretion was required. She'd studied the floor plan. She knew where the private dining section was relative to the building's structural columns, which affected signal bounce, which she'd accounted for. The transmitter connected at 7:04 p.m. The room came to life in her earpiece. She heard the ambient sounds first, the specific acoustic quality of a high-ceiling private space, 4 men already present, the low-register conversation of people who believe themselves to be completely secure. She heard a voice she recognized from recordings she'd built over 18 months. The general. Older than she'd imagined from his operational profile, quieter. The architects of large-scale damage always were. She opened the broadcast protocol. 7 channels, all standing by. At 7:11, Jeju-eo was announced by the sound of a door. She heard his footsteps. She'd learned them, had cataloged their specific rhythm over 2 days in her shop, and she heard the room's energy shift in the way rooms shift when the person everyone has come to watch finally arrives. They started cordially. They always started cordially. She listened to the general explain, in the smooth, practiced language of institutional authority, that the developments of the past several weeks had made Jeju-eo's position within the operational network untenable. That decisions had been made, that certain accommodations would be offered in exchange for a clean and quiet transition. The language was surgical and dressed in the specific vocabulary of men who have never once had to name the uglier words for what they do. Jeju-eo said very little. He asked questions, small ones, the kind a desperate man asks when he's hoping for any opening. And they answered him. Of course they answered him. Desperate men are safe. Desperate men don't have leverage. They answered him with the comfortable specificity of people who have absolute confidence in the architecture of their own protection. The general, at 7:34 p.m., said the words she'd been waiting 3 years to hear spoken clearly into a recording. The name of the program, the nature of the funding, the specific arrangement that had consumed her career and her name and her life. He said it the way men say things they believe will never be used against them, with the quiet, damning articulacy of someone who has been articulate about this privately for so long that it has lost its danger to him. She pressed the broadcast trigger at 7:35. All 7 streams went live simultaneously. 4 journalists, 2 federal investigators who had been briefed and were standing by, 1 independent media outlet whose lead reporter had her personal number and had been waiting for this specific package for 8 weeks. She'd also built a dead man relay. If the broadcast was interrupted, it went to 12 additional recipients automatically. She sat very still in her broken shop and listened to the audio run clean. At 7:41, she heard the first disruption on the feed. Not violence, just the specific quality of a room in which several people have simultaneously understood that the ground has moved. A chair. A voice rising before catching itself. At 7:43, she heard Jeju-eo stand. She heard it in the sound of him. The composed, deliberate scrape of a chair pushed back, the shift in his voice from the controlled flatness of a man performing defeat to something that was quiet in a different way entirely. "You should check your phones," he said. She almost smiled. Almost. By 8 o'clock, it was everywhere. Not one outlet. All of them, simultaneously. With documentation so thorough and cross-referenced that the story assembled itself without needing to be sold to anyone. The general, the 2 financial architects, the operations coordinator, their own voices, their own admissions, their own language used against them with a precision they had never anticipated, because the woman who'd built the case had been invisible to them for 3 years, and they'd never once thought to look. Their lawyers made calls. The calls went unanswered or were answered by people who were already managing their own exposure. The public story moved the way media moves when the documentation is airtight, fast, and total, no seams to work a counter-narrative into. The court of public opinion, which had been so efficiently weaponized against Jeju-eo 1 week prior, turned with the same speed in the opposite direction. Except this time it didn't just shift, it broke open, because the evidence wasn't curated to suggest, it was constructed to prove. Cassia sat with her coffee and read every headline in the order they dropped. She didn't celebrate. That wasn't in her nature. She sat with it instead, the specific weight of 3 years of patience arriving at its destination, the particular quality of a long-held breath finally released. The shop around her was broken. The shelves were down. The floor was scattered with inventory and glass and the concrete evidence of the previous night. The morning light would come in gold again, eventually. She'd rebuild. This time with Korean imports in Section 4. She'd already measured the space. Her phone lit up at 8:47. A text from a number she'd given only one person. Clean exit. Ribs are fine. Mostly. She looked at the message for a moment. Then she typed back, "Business hours are 9 to 6. Don't be late." Outside, the neighborhood was waking up. Mrs. Park's light was on across the street. The delivery truck was idling 2 blocks over. The bell above the door was still, but the mechanism was intact. She'd checked it when she came in. Cassia Thorne tied her apron, turned the sign to open, and went back to work. In the back room on the workstation screen, the last of the 7 broadcast channels was still running. Recording, documenting, watching, because some habits once built become load-bearing, and because the woman who'd built this operation had learned, over 3 years of careful and costly silence, that the work is never really finished. It just changes shape. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment below with your location and don't forget to like and subscribe for more interesting stories. I want to see where this story is haunting people right now. And if you feel like someone is watching you, you're probably not alone.